In the name of the one holy and undivided Trinity. Amen.
Amen.
You may be seated. So there is a theological term. It's called theodicy. And it is defined in Westminster's Dictionary of Theological Terms as the justification of a deity's justice and goodness in light of suffering and evil. Basically, in other words, how do we reconcile an omnipotent and loving God with the reality of suffering and evil in the world? To say it's a fair question. And whenever someone asks it, I often find myself returning to this gospel lesson we just heard when trying to explain it. Because this story, I think, that's found in John's gospel this morning helps to explain it better than anything else I've ever been able to come up with. Now, you may also have noticed the smell of corned beef and cabbage wafting from our kitchen this morning. It was really hard to concentrate Friday afternoon with all the wonderful smells going around this building. And while St. Patrick's Day is Tuesday, we're sort of moving it up a couple of days and celebrating this special feast day a couple of days early. Now, before the traditions of guzzling green beer, drinking Guinness, and turning rivers green, the church was celebrating this person who was an example of genuine Christian holiness for many, many years before those traditions. Patrick, who was known as the Apostle of Ireland, was a 5th century British missionary who had later served as Bishop of Ireland. Now, according to tradition, he was first the Bishop of Armagh and then later became the Primate of Ireland. And it is Patrick who is credited with bringing Christianity to this island. In his autobiography, The Confessio, Patrick tells us that when he was about 16 years old, he was captured by Irish pirates, captured from his home in Britain, and carried off to Ireland to serve. He was a slave to those Irish pirates. He lived there for about 6 years as a shepherd. They kept him in relative isolation. But somehow, after about 6 years in enslavement, he was able to escape and he returned home to Britain. And later, after becoming a priest, he would return to Ireland once again. This time not as a slave, but as a missionary. He spent much of his ministry in the northern and western parts of the island preaching the gospel. And so every March 17th, we celebrate St. Patrick, which was the date of his death. I think when we think about Patrick, we think about things like his kidnapping. We think about events like the Crusades, the Holocaust, the dropping of the atomic bomb, Bosnian genocide, Rwandan genocide, and other countless atrocities throughout history. We quickly realize something. Providence, or rather God's providence, its divine purpose for human affairs is not neat. There's no neat Christian explanation for this history. And it's really not a satisfying answer to explain away the horrors of the world. But I think providence, though, is a confession of faith. It is a confession of trust. And it is the belief that God can work in and through human events to reveal his purposes. Even, maybe especially, when those events themselves are tragic or unjust. And I think it's this lesson, this reading, this gospel reading we heard this morning that does that work of helping us to understand that. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is performing what the Gospels call signs. Right? We hear about his miracles in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels. But in the Gospel of John, Jesus performs signs. Because what Jesus is doing is pointing towards who he is. And it's important about what those signs are pointing to, what those signs are revealing, which is a deeper reality of who Jesus is. The truth about who Jesus is, what is being revealed we learn about this from the very beginning of the gospel, in the prologue to John. In the beginning was the Word. And this man, this morning that we hear, who was born blind, becomes someone who is helping us to see Jesus more clearly. Because you see, in our liturgy and what we do every Sunday, we do something very similar to what's happening this morning. We use ordinary things, right? We use bread and wine. Or we hear this morning, Jesus used mud and spit. And these simple things, right, they become signs that reveal for us who Jesus is, who Christ is among us. Because ultimately the story is not about physical sight. So often we find ourselves in the same place as the disciples this morning. We want to know what caused this to happen. Right? We hear the disciples ask, who sinned? This man or his parents? There's got to be an explanation for what's happening. Some cause, some reason. I can only imagine that Patrick asked the same things, the same questions during those years he was in slavery in Ireland. Why did this happen? Why is it happening to me? What caused this? But in our gospel story this morning, blindness is not presented as punishment. Right? It's not the result of someone's moral failure. Instead, blindness really becomes something more of a place, a condition of the human state, condition of our human life, a state of not yet seeing. And what transforms that condition? It's not an explanation. It's an encounter. Once we did not understand who Jesus was, but through his actions, through these signs, Jesus reveals his identity to us. And in that revelation, something changes. Something changes in Jesus and the man in us. We move away from needing to explain how Jesus does what he does. And we then begin to explain, to recognize, to see what has happened to us. Like the man in the gospel, we find ourselves saying something very simple. Like, once I was like this, but now I am like this. Because now we're able to confess Jesus, and because of that, we no longer feel the need to explain him. The man was blind, and Jesus healed him, and his sight was restored. Right? It's mystery. We don't know exactly how it happened, and we cannot prove that it happened. But the man knows what he experienced. And in the end, his testimony is very simple. Once I was blind, but now I see. Amen.